Welcome back, episode 7, John Iadarola here yet again. We've got a special surprise for you this week. The surprise? Still no name of the show. You might not actually be that surprised by it. But we've got this big stack of papers here. Serious stories, fun stories. We're going to get to all of them. Eventually, at the end, as always, I will be responding to some of your recent Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook questions and comments. But first, we've got a number of important stories collected throughout the week, stuff that I think is going to be relevant in the coming months. And so let's get right into it. Tesla, the premier golden child, I guess, of the electric automobile movement, has suffered a series of not unexpected but unfortunate legal losses in Texas and North Carolina. So let's give you the details on what both of those are. In Texas, the state legislature declined to make an exception to existing rules that make it illegal for automakers to sell cars to retail buyers. Now, moving to North Carolina, a Senate committee unanimously approved a bill making it illegal to sell new cars over the internet. Now, neither of those bills specifically mention Tesla or electric automobiles or anything like that, but they do unfortunately have significant consequences for the EV manufacturer. And so basically, almost every state in the country, almost all 50 states, have some sort of law that makes it illegal for automakers to sell directly to consumers, either over the internet or through their own dealerships. Obviously, many of the bills came about before the internet even existed, so most of them don't mention that in their legalese. But so at one point, the third-party used car dealers, or not even used necessarily, the third-party automobile dealers did not want to face competition from the auto manufacturers selling directly to the consumer. And because of the power of this lobbying group that you may not even know was as powerful as it is across the country, they've had these bills on the books across the country. Now, Tesla's been fighting in Texas and in North Carolina in particular because they have particularly harsh and stringent requirements on the sale of automobiles. And unfortunately, despite the fact that Elon Musk, the CEO of Tesla, has been traveling to these states, he's been testifying before the state legislatures there, he was unable to get them to side with him. And so in the near future, it will be impossible, or at least nearly impossible, for consumers in Texas and North Carolina to buy Tesla automobiles, which right now is just the Model S, but new cars will be coming out in the next couple of years. Now, I'm going to talk about why I'm personally pissed off about this, but first I'll let Elon Musk say that he thinks that this is not only anti-competitive, I think that goes without saying, but it also is completely against the interests of the consumers. The consumers are not from the 1940s. They live in a modern world where we're used to buying things directly through Apple's website. For instance, he cites they've done surveys. 86 to 99% of respondents approved of Tesla's direct sales model, often likened to buyers purchasing iPads and iPods directly from Apple. But also think about Amazon, all sorts of things that you're used to not having to buy through a third party anymore. And so he is obviously not happy with this. Now, Tesla has been having a great year. They've been outselling competing models in BMW, Mercedes, and other luxury automobile manufacturers and things like that. But I personally have a problem with this because I'm in the middle of my own automobile search, and I do not want to have to deal with the third-party auto sellers, let alone used auto sellers. And in particular, when it comes to EVs like Tesla, this is, I believe, the future of not just U.S. automobiles, but globally, the automobile market. I think that this is a chance, possibly, for America to get back into a leading role globally in the manufacture and sales of automobiles, something that we've been behind Toyota, behind Honda, for a number of decades. And for North Carolina and Texas to be so short-sighted, to bow down to the power of these interest groups, I think that that's personally pathetic. I think that it's extremely anti-competitive, and these Republican legislatures, which like to talk about capitalism and the free market, obviously don't really believe in it. And look, I feel a little bit bad, I guess, for the third-party dealers that might be put out of business if this direct sale from the manufacturers to the consumers eventually goes through. But look, that's progress, baby. Accept it. Okay, let's move on. More ridiculous stuff. Cannibals are sweeping across the globe, eating people's body parts, and Glenn Beck believes that this is a sign of the end times. How does he know that? Because he's been reading the Book of Mormon. Now, before I absolutely tear apart his ridiculous argument, let's let him tell it in his own words.
towards the very end, one of the last books, it talks about, and everything is to repeat itself, and it talks about how the enemies that they were up against at that time were into cannibalism, and they were eating people as a sign of bravery and courage. And when I saw the video of two videos, one in Russia, where the Russian rebels are eating people, the Russian drug lords are actually eating their enemies. And when I saw the video of a soldier in the groups that we are arming stand on a battlefield and cut the chest open and take a beating heart out of a dead body, cut him open, take it out and eat it, and use it as courage, I thought to myself, I know this calendar. I've seen this movie before. I warn you, we are in very dangerous times. We are living in biblical times. I told my staff a long time ago, when you hear me start talking about God, you'll know we're at a different DEFCON level. When you start hearing me use the words Jesus Christ on the air, because I know what it does to my popularity, I know what it does to, I know what it does. And I know how it makes you a new crazy Christian kook. And I said we will be at a much different DEFCON level when I start saying Jesus Christ and quoting the Bible. If you ever hear me mention the Book of Mormon on the air, we are at the end.
So Glenn Beck has been reading these 150 or so year-old religious texts and believes that they are directly speaking to the current situation in Syria, Russia, the United States, and things of that sort. Now look, this is ridiculous. I don't want to down on any Mormons. They seem like lovely people, all that I've met, lovely people. But as with any religion, not just Mormonism, trying to directly read modern political circumstances and contexts into the historic books of the Book of Mormon, or go back a couple thousand years. I mean, you could go to the Torah, the Quran, the Bible, and things of that sort, is obviously ridiculous. Now look, the situation in Syria is incredibly rough, and we have seen videos showing cannibalism. It's not entirely clear to me that it's not just propaganda put out by the government of Syria, because it seems perfectly designed to discredit the movement. And I have a feeling that one person eating the heart of a dead soldier is not exactly necessarily representative of the entire rebel movement in Syria. But look, I don't want to be on the side of cannibals. I think most people don't. We've seen the movies. They're scary people. I don't like zombies. Don't want to side with them. But I think that Glenn Beck is really reaching here. Now look, he is suffering under a couple of very harsh circumstances. He has to fill a lot of air every single day, very rough. His audience they're a bunch of insane people, and so you have to be increasingly insane to keep them satisfied. It's like pornography. It has to get more and more hardcore, or people can't get off. And he's got a bunch of psychos that want to get politically off. And so he is obligated at this point to say this sort of crazy stuff. And if he can mix religion into it, all the better for his insane audience. And look, we like to point out when Glenn Beck says crazy things. This week he talked about the fact that he is a whistleblower who's going to take down the entire U.S. government. That has not happened yet. I think it's unlikely that it will happen. But the whole that we're moving into the end times thing, look, cannibals are not a sign of that. The struggle between the Syrian rebels and the government of Assad is not a sign of that. What we're seeing in Syria right now is something that's been played out in a number of countries over the last few thousand years. It's a rebel movement against an authoritarian government. Happens all the time, unfortunately. It doesn't happen as often now in the modern times because we've generally stamped down most of that. And look, I don't know exactly how the U.S. or the Russian government are going to proceed from here, but I think that regardless of what path they take, their policies are not going to be chosen because of the influence of cannibals. And I think that if any of you are somehow viewers of this program and Glenn Beck, anytime you hear talk of the end times, you need to take it with a grain of salt, because this sort of discussion has been going on for the last 2,000 years. And the reason they want you to believe that Jesus is about to come down from the heavens and the world is about to end is because if you believe that the world has less than 50 or so years left to go, you will agree to almost any crazy policy, because why not? There's no real consequences if the world is going to disappear next week. That plays into what they want, their policy preferences, but not necessarily yours. So whether it's Glenn Beck, whether it's Alex Jones, whether it's Pat Robertson or one of these other evangelical preachers, be very careful when you hear talk of the end times. Now, while cannibals are not causing the governments of the world to fall apart, parts of the world are actually falling apart, in particular the Antarctic. Now, when you imagine global warming operating, the general way that we see it happening are these videos that we see of the Antarctic, of Greenland, huge icebergs breaking off of the ice shelves there, and it seems like that's the way that it's mostly happening, that things are falling off of the edges of these large accumulations of ice and snow and things like that. Turns out, with new data, we're finding out that much of the actual loss of ice in these ice shelves is not coming off of the outward edges of it, but that they're actually like falling apart and melting from the bottom up. And so this is new data coming from UC Irvine. The researcher is Eric Rigneau and a number of his colleagues working in conjunction with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. And so they studied 2007 and 2008 ice shelf thickness and the speed and accumulation of snowfall over those periods of time. And they've actually got some very interesting results. And so what they found is that 48% of the meltwater lost through 2007 and 2008 was lost from ice shelves that came from the smaller shelves on the southeastern Pacific side of the Antarctic. And by the way, these smaller shelves, these smaller units that they're looking at, account for only about 8% of the total ice shelf cover in the Antarctic. And so these very small regions that previously had not been researched in any great degree are actually accounting for a great deal of lost meltwater there. And so one of the reasons that this is happening, one of the results of this data that's been gathered by Eric Rigneau, is that the disproportionate loss from the smaller ice shelves is because the smaller shelves sit on relatively warmer water than the bigger shelves. And so at this point, you need to bear in mind that some of the ice shelves are directly resting on the bottom of the sea, basically. Those are to some degree resistant to this sort of melting from the water underneath. But the arms, the other ice shelves sticking off of that area, do have the ocean directly underneath them. And the farther you go out into the Pacific in some of these areas, the temperature of the ocean is significantly higher, and that's why you're seeing this increased melting in those areas. Now, this new data, accumulated from 2007 and 2008, is unlikely to convince anyone who doesn't believe that global warming is going on, or if they believe that global warming is happening, but it's because of cycles in the environment, unicorn farts, whatever stupid explanation they have for it, this is unlikely to change their minds. But I think that it does give us, in conjunction with the recent data that the carbon parts per million went above 400 for the first time ever measured, that something needs to be done. And now bear in mind, look, you've been watching politics, you've been watching the news for the past couple of weeks. What are we talking about? Now we're talking about the NSA. If we ever stop talking about that, maybe we'll touch on Turkey and Syria, go back to the IRS scandal, the AP scandal. Do you know how many pages you need to flip through the newspaper recently to find anything about global climate change? Yeah, you have to go pretty far. And so parts of the world, important parts, that are going to have big consequences on the geopolitical environment of the world in decades and centuries to come, are changing rapidly. It's not being covered by most news sources. There are some, Brad Blog, Alternet, Raw Story, outlets like that. But these are very important, not just environmental matters, but they're going to have important political ramifications, and it needs more coverage than it's currently getting. So whether these massive icebergs are falling off the sides of Antarctica or it's melting from the bottom up, this is going to have a very major effect on humanity in the centuries to come. And so pay attention to that. Okay, moving domestically again. 3D guns have been all over the news for the past few months, and now finally a state government is making a move to try to ban them. We're going to cover the bill, this is coming out of New York, and then talk about some of the consequences of it. So, the New York State Senate has a bill that would amend the New York Administrative Code to make it illegal to use a 3D printer to create any part of a firearm unless the person is a licensed gunsmith. A gunsmith using a 3D printer to print any part of a gun would be required to notify the NYPD and register it within 72 hours after the manufacture. In addition, proposed revisions to the code include language ensuring 3D printed guns fall under the same regulations as other firearms already do, and this includes clarification on systems to feed bullets, requirements for a serial number, and regulations against destroying weapons. Now, this is the bill that's currently being debated and has the most chance of possibly passing the New York legislature. There is another that's being sponsored by State Assemblywoman Linda Rosenthal of Manhattan, which has a lower chance of being passed. Now, I'm not covering this because I think that this is like the way to stop the 3D printed gun threat. I think that they're doing what they can in a relatively liberal state to fight back against a perceived threat. I think that bills like this are extremely unlikely to have any effect on the construction and manufacture of these 3D printed guns. Because really, how are you going to enforce it? Like, somebody gets sold the 3D printer, which are not hard to get, by the way, and when you buy one, there's no indication that you're buying one to construct 3D printed guns, and then you can print them. I mean, maybe they'll try to track the torrents. That seems extremely unlikely to be effective. But so I guess props for them for trying to, in their view, protect their people, but it's unlikely that this is going to have any effect on the actual manufacture of the 3D printed guns. Now, this article, which is coming out of the Epoch Times, also quotes a couple of former homicide detectives, one in particular, Ernie Encinas. He is not very worried about 3D printed guns posing a significant threat in the future. He says, "I don't think it's going to be that big of a problem, people making their own guns. Why would you use a cheap gun when you can get a regular one on the black market? If a bad guy wants a gun, he's going to get a gun." Now, I know for those of you who are in favor of 3D printed guns and believe in a very strong interpretation of the Second Amendment rights to firearms, you probably agree with this. And I think to some extent, Ernie Encinas has a point. Now, I think, though, when you say if a bad guy wants a gun, he's going to get a gun, that is extremely oversimplifying the importance of difficulty in dissuading someone from doing something. So currently, let's say an analogy, it's similar actually because it involves the torrents. If I want to download a movie or something like that, if there's one place that offers the torrent rather than 10, it's harder to get it. Okay, I might still download it to use his analogy. If I want the torrent, I'm going to get the torrent. But I'm less likely, I suppose, especially if there aren't a lot of people seeding it on that particular torrent site. If I know that it's going to take a very long time to download it in the future, I'm less likely to continue to do so. And so the difficulty in acquiring something does affect behavior. And when it comes to the illegal use of these firearms, we want it to be more difficult. In particular, because not all crimes, in analogies like this, it seems to be as if these criminals are all these masterminds who are planning out, okay, here's what I'm going to do in 3 weeks. And look, if I have to go to the black market, or if I can download a torrent that'll allow me to blueprint out a 3D printed gun, then I'm just going to move on to the next step of my plan. But that's not how it works in all cases. There are crimes of passion. There are people who act irrationally in the moment. A 3D printed gun is not something that you can create in 5 minutes. But if you know someone who has a 3D printer, or if you have one, the access to the 3D printed blueprint could be something that in a time of emotion is something that you might pursue. And so making it a little bit more difficult may allow you to move past that emotional state. So look, I'm not going to continue to debate the merits of 3D printed guns. I think that they're out there. More sophisticated designs will continue to be distributed throughout the world. I'm personally a bit scared by the prospect, but I understand that there's very little that can be done at this point to stop the spread. I think that New York is doing what they think they need to protect their people, but the chance that this bill is really going to stop the continued distribution of these blueprints or the manufacture of the actual guns seems at the present dicey at best. Okay, let's move on to some social issues. The debate over abortions goes on at the federal level and at the state level across the U.S., with different states continuing to pass increasingly restrictive anti-abortion laws. Now, what's often left out of the debate over whether or not abortion should be legal or easily accessible in different states is what actually happens to women when they're denied an abortion. And it may surprise you to find out that this is not something that social scientists have actually researched in great detail in the past. But we do have a study that's been going on for a couple of years now. So Diana Green Foster, who is from the University of California, San Francisco, has been tracking women who have been able to get an abortion and women who were denied an abortion, which had not previously been done. And she's been following them for a couple of years and continuing to survey their financial state, their emotional state, and finding out what actually happened to them after their interaction with abortion policy in the United States. And the details from this study are quite interesting, actually. So let's read directly from her study. Compared to their peers who received abortions, women who can't get the abortions that they want have poorer health and are more likely to live in poverty 2 years on. even though they qualified for government assistance programs as new moms. Meanwhile, everybody in the study, whether they got abortions or not, generally have the same level of depression and anxiety. Now, this is very interesting because I'm a firm believer in looking at the data and to some extent at least having our policies be driven by social science research like this study by Diana Green Foster. Now, what's often left out of the debate over abortion is empathy for the women. Now, pro-life people will often say that the reason that they're against abortion is because they feel so strongly that the babies need to be protected. And while I disagree with them about the ethics of it and the legality of what they're saying, the constitutionality of what they're saying, I at least respect that there is some empathy driving their position when it's not an elderly conservative male who seems to be more driven by wanting to control women's bodies, at least. But empathy for the women themselves is often extremely lacking, and the policies that anti-abortion advocates will use, like the transvaginal ultrasounds, the having to look at the ultrasounds, the descriptions of the pseudoscience about what happens after abortion, I think is often intended to shame and harm the women. I think that that's pretty clear. Now here we're finding out what actually happens to women if they're denied an abortion, and it turns out that it's not very good. We're talking about depression, we're talking about hard financial situations if they're denied the abortion, and not surprisingly, these are the things that women were worried about when they were considering getting the abortion in the first place. And if these laws continue to be passed that restrict access to abortion across the country, we're only going to have more and more of these women in the years to come. Now, this is a struggle we've been having for an extremely long time in this country. Roe v. Wade is decades and decades old. Entire generations of people have been born, lived and died under this, lived and now have grown up to fight abortion themselves. Women who have never lived in a world where abortion was universally illegal or illegal across an entire state. And yet it's still a debate we're having now. Will the data from this study convince anti-abortion advocates to change their position? Probably not. I think it's safe to say that they're not going to be influenced by the data. But I hope that if this study and studies like it in the future get some coverage, at least we might have an influx of empathy for these women enter into the policy debate. I think that's something that's been sorely lacking up until this point. Okay, moving on. Somebody who probably lacks a little bit of empathy for women. Let's talk about Ken Fredette. The House Minority Leader of Maine, Ken Fredette, was recently on tape talking about the debate over the expansion of Obamacare in Maine, and he used some questionable words to describe why he's opposed to it. Let's watch.
As I listened to the debate today and an earlier debate on this bill, I can't help but think of a title of a book, Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus. And it's a book about the fact that men sort of think one way in their own brain, in their own world, and women think another way in their brain, in their own world. And it really talks about the way that men and women can do a better job at communicating. Because if you listen to the debate today, in my mind, a man's mind, I hear really two fundamental issues. From the other side of the aisle, I hear the conversation being about free. This is free, we need to take it, and it's free. And we need to do it now. And that's sort of the fundamental message that my brain receives. Now, my brain, being a man's brain, sort of thinks differently. Because I say, well, it's not, if it's free, is it really free? Because I say, in my brain, there's a cost to this.
Oops. Now, look, you can be opposed to the expansion of Obamacare for a number of different reasons, and people are opposed for a number of different reasons, but explaining that your opposition is rooted in the difference between your brain and a woman's brain, delivered in words that can only be taken as insulting to women, is questionable. And I think that this is a great example of how political natural selection works. This guy's chances to go on to higher office are significantly lower now, and probably should be. Because if your man's brain is so powerful that it can decipher out exactly what's going to happen with Obamacare, you would hope that it would also be powerful and intuitive enough to know not to use terms like man's brain. Now look, are there differences between the brains of men and women? Yes, there are some differences, whether biological or learned through our education system. There are some differences, some small ways that women's brains are more effective in particular areas or men's brains are more effective. But the important thing to bear in mind when talking about these differences between the brains of men and women is that the difference between men and women is smaller than the difference between individuals within that gender. So men might be, for example, throwing it out there, 4% better at spatial reasoning or something like that. But the difference between men is in spatial reasoning is significantly more than 4%. The difference between women in that spatial reasoning is significantly more than 4%. So to say that there's a difference between men and women conceals more than it reveals in this case. Now look, Ken Fredette, I assume, not the smartest guy, maybe like Joe Biden, he just speaks without thinking. And look, he read Men Are From Mars, Women From Venus when it came out like 25 years ago, and he's still affected by it. I can understand that. I'm often overly affected by the things I read. Usually it wears off after a couple of decades. That seems to not be the case with Ken Fredette. But anyway, I'm mostly covering this, not because the inner workings of the Maine Senate are all that important to me, but I'm wondering, this sort of terminology, not man's brain, but the anti-female rhetoric is getting increasingly common, both at the state level and at the federal level for Republicans. And I'm really targeting this video to the women out there. Are you actually offended by statements like this? Because there doesn't seem to be a lot of punishment for when these Republican politicians dish out this anti-female rhetoric. Now, there are some examples, Aiken and things like that, where it has hurt them, but not as commonly as you'd think. So for the women viewing this, I want you to write a comment and let me know, am I making more out of this than I should be? Are women not as sensitive as male political pundits seem to think they are? Maybe that's not the case, and I understand that the women viewing this are probably liberals, but let me know what you think. Okay, let's cover one more story, and then I think we're going to take a short break. We've still got a number of stories to get to, but this one's a fun one, so let's burn through this. The NRA recently aired an ad intended to attack Democrat Joe Manchin, the senator of West Virginia. It looks like, in hindsight, they probably did more damage to themselves, though. Let's take a look.
Remember this TV ad?
I'm Joe Manchin. I approve this ad because I'll always defend West Virginia. As your senator, I'll protect our Second Amendment rights.
That was Joe Manchin's commitment. But now, Manchin is working with President Obama and New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg. Concerned? You should be. Tell Senator Manchin to honor his commitment to the Second Amendment.
Now, as expected, there was an uproar about the darkening or the perceived darkening. Screw perceived. They darkened Obama's skin, and people had a problem with it. The obvious parallel is to O.J. Simpson back more than 15 years ago, I guess now. He was on the cover of a magazine, and his skin was significantly darkened. And the idea there, obviously, is that they're trying to make him seem more sinister, more of an other. Obama does not have particularly dark skin to begin with, and so it seems like they're trying to cast him in a dark light. And people have a problem with that. And so before I talk about whether or not I think this was intentional and we should get up in arms about the NRA's ad, Joe Scarborough was talking about this. He was not happy. Now, sometimes he gets the issues right, sometimes he doesn't. Let's read his quote. He says, "Look at his hands. It looks like he's a coal miner from West Virginia. Look how dark they made his hands. Look at the side of his face. This is a question that answers itself." I'm a lib. I know I'm expected to have a knee-jerk reaction to declare racism on anything I see. And look, the NRA has about as established a history of racism as is possible for an organization in the U.S. I'm not sure that I'm buying it in this case. Now, with O.J. Simpson, I think it was very clear, and it's happened since then in some ads. And so I think that African-American politicians always have to be on the lookout for that. Not just African-Americans, Hispanic politicians as well. There was, I think in Arizona, there was an ad where a couple of Hispanic youths were made to look incredibly dark and ominous. And so that is something that happens in the U.S., but I think that Scarborough is a bit too sure of himself in this case. Now, look, does the NRA want to make Obama seem like an other? Yes. Does the NRA probably harbor a number of men in their upper echelons of their advertising department that are a little bit conservative, racially conservative? Yes, I think that that's clear. But I also understand that when you're creating an ad, you use the ominous music, you color grade to make your guy look more attractive and theirs less attractive. That sort of thing happens all the time. And so I think that if you want to interpret this as being a racial attack on Obama, feel free to do so. I think that there is some evidence for that, but I don't think that it's an open and shut case. There are reasons to oppose the NRA recently. Their lack of empathy for the victims of mass shootings, I think, is a great one. But racial attacks against Obama in this particular Joe Manchin ad, I don't think that that's the best route to attack the NRA. So we're going to take a short break. We've been making some great progress with these stories. There's more great news to come, so stick around. We've got a Bill of Rights for a group that you might not have expected. We've got some awesome apocalyptic quotes from Michelle Bachmann and Ann Coulter. We've got some controversial rape comments. We've got an actor returning to the stage that I never thought I would see him in another action movie. Who is it? Stick around and you'll find out. Back on the second half of the show. Now, we've got some good news for you coming up. We've also got some bad news for you. That's pretty much how the show is always going to go. You know, I don't want you guys to be so depressed by what's going on that you back off from politics altogether. But we do have to cover the unfortunate things if we're going to fight against them. So there's going to be a little bit of that. But we are going to be starting off with what I perceive to be some good news. And we're going to be turning to my home state to do it, by the way. Excuse me. In a political environment seemingly constantly inundated by regressive legislation, it's odd that we find a bill that actually seems to be trying purely, genuinely to do what's best for a group of people. And we have a Bill of Rights law for a group that I can't believe that this actually passed, because I can't imagine it passing in most states in the country. So what I'm talking about is my home state of Connecticut recently passed a homeless person's Bill of Rights law. Now, when I saw this, I was struck by, wow, that actually made it through. Not because there is necessarily a strong anti-homeless person lobby. There's no organized corporate interest that I know of. But most people in the country, not big fans of the homeless, not big fans of panhandling and things like that. So we're going to cover the details of this Homeless People's Bill of Rights, and then we're going to talk about whether or not this might spread to other states. So the bill has 7 different protections for the homeless. This is going to take a little bit of time, but we got to get through it. The first, move freely in public spaces, including on public sidewalks, in public parks, on public transportation, and in public buildings without harassment or intimidation from law enforcement officers in the same manner as other persons. Second, to have equal opportunities for employment. Number 3, receive emergency medical care. Number 4, register to vote and to vote. I think that's a typo. Number 4, register to vote. Number 5, have personal information protected. Number 6, have a reasonable expectation of privacy in his or her personal property. And finally, the 7th protection in this bill, receive equal treatment by state and municipal agencies. So as I said, this is a fairly progressive piece of legislation because it's all too easy to forget that the homeless exist, or to try to pretend at the very least that they exist. And look, there are some organizations around the country that are trying to do right by the homeless. I have a friend from graduate school, Jake McGuire, who's doing that work, and I think that's extremely important. It's very hard to deal with the problem of homelessness because of the influence of mental health issues in this population. Some homeless who want to be homeless, it's not as common as you think. Don't allow that to completely color your view of the homeless, but it is an issue. And also the fact that the population at large does not like the homeless. They don't want to deal with them. They don't want to see them. They see them as, at best, an annoyance. And so to have a bill like this pass the Connecticut legislature, I think that's pretty surprising. Now, it has not yet been signed by the governor, Dan Malloy, but he is a Democrat. He has a pretty progressive track record in my experience of viewing Connecticut politics, and so it's likely that it will pass. Now, could this be a template for similar legislation across the country? That's an interesting question. Now, Rhode Island has already passed a similar homeless person's Bill of Rights. Didn't know that, so A little bit of political credit for Rhode Island there, being pretty progressive. Illinois is also has passed through the legislature, similar to Connecticut, a Bill of Rights like this. Now it's waiting for Governor Pat Quinn to sign it. Again, don't know if that's going to happen. He is a Democrat, bear that in mind. And Oregon and Delaware are also considering pieces of legislation like this. Now, I don't know if this will spread. I think there are a number of states that would never pass anything like this because, look, they're filled up with politicians and people that just love to hate. And it's very easy to hate the homeless. Usually most people's only interaction with them is coming up to your car, asking you for $1, things like that. It's easy to be annoyed by that, and I understand that. As a lib, I understand that. But these are people that have very harsh lives. It's extremely hard for them to get any kind of medical care, including mental health care, which many of them, because of their experience in war and their complete isolation from human contact, could probably use. Intimidation by the police, being beaten up and killed in many areas of the country by teenagers who see it as some kind of fun blood sport. There are a lot of problems for the homeless. And so, at the very least, for Connecticut, this seems like a good step forward. Interesting point of speculation. Let me know what you think. With this passing in Connecticut, what do you think the chances are that homeless in surrounding states will move into Connecticut? Maybe that's a little conspiracy theory, and I'm sure that was part of the debate over this. Let me know what you think. Okay, now, talking about movements of people, we've got some immigration news for you. I'm going to take a little sip of my tea before I start. I want to keep the throat well lubricated. Phrasing. And then let's get into this. So, immigration reform is being debated both on the Republican side and the Democratic side. A couple of the crazies on the Republican side cannot talk about it without referring to it as amnesty, and once they've labeled it that, they're against it. And so we've got quotes from Michelle Bachmann and Ann Coulter talking about the immigration reform and the apocalyptic effects it might have if it passes. So first, Michelle Bachmann, she says, "This is President Obama's #1 political agenda item because he knows we will never again have a Republican president, ever, if amnesty goes into effect. We will perpetually have a progressive liberal president, probably a Democrat, and we will probably see the House of Representatives go into Democrat hands, and the Senate will stay in Democrat hands." Now, she's soon to be not a politician. You would expect that while she's in the office, she would be a little bit more politically responsible. Not the case with her. Let's move into someone who has no history of political responsibility, Ann Coulter. Now, she's banned on the Young Turks, not yet banned here. We'll see how it shakes out in the coming months. She says, before we get to her quotes, by the way, she was on Hannity, and they had a little fight. They got a little bit feisty. They had a little cat fight. And so I love how juvenile this ended up being. So Hannity says, "You're not answering my question. You're like a liberal." And she responds, "No, nothing. You, on the contrary, you're like a liberal." That's how two political adults sound when they're debating the issues. But anyway, moving past that little grievance with her, I think that she's ridiculous. She says, "If amnesty happens, America is over. And the only thing left for people like you and me to do, Sean, is to punish the people who destroyed America." And so look, the common thread going throughout these two insane women's arguments is that if amnesty passes, if immigration reform passes, and we have more Hispanics move into the country, demographically, you know that they're likely to vote for Democrats, especially if they move into areas like Nevada, Texas, maybe Florida, I guess, traditional swing states or states that we expect in the coming decades to be swing states. If they could flip that to the Democrats, then it seems like all else being equal, you will never again have a Republican voted into office as president of the United States. The problem is all else is not equal. And when you're talking about something that could take 1, 2, 3 decades to happen, expecting that you can change one variable and keep all the others constant, that's at best politically naive. And look, I'm gonna attack both Democrats and Republicans here. So we talked about this recently in the Young Turks, and Cenk does believe that if a significant number of Hispanics move into the country, it will mean that basically we'll never have another Republican. And I understand why he says that, the eagerness behind it, the desire to have actual Democrats be voted into office and possibly actually pass some liberal legislation. I get that, and I understand that, and I also understand why Ann Coulter is speaking so apocalyptically. Perversely, it's actually kind of in her interest for this to happen. Because if you always had Democratic presidents, she would always have somebody to scapegoat, somebody to attack in her stupid little books. And so for her, it actually would kind of have a silver lining. Here's the thing. Political parties are not static. They change over time. The groups that make up political parties changes too. So at one point, environmentalists didn't necessarily always follow the Democrats. At one point, Nixon passed, created the EPA and things like that. But the Democrats passed legislation that the environmentalists liked. In part, they're not doing enough on global warming, but whatever, this is the example I'm using. And so now you can expect that environmentalists will probably, for the most part, vote for the Democrats. And so, but these groups can change. If in the future the Republicans actually did something that was good for the environment, maybe they'd get some more voters from those environmentalists. And in the same way, let's say hypothetically 50 million Hispanics moved in, they all voted for the Democrats, and we had 3 presidential cycles go by, and they're all Democrat, Democrat, Democrat because of the votes of these Hispanics. The idea that the Republicans would just continue to throw up xenophobic, anti-Hispanic assholes as their presidential nominees, that's absurd. Look, these parties are in some ways responsible to themselves at the very least, and to their electoral chances. And so, look, they would love to continue on, the Republicans would, in the way that they have, being xenophobic, anti-Hispanic, and racist, and all of that. But if the only way to get into power and to continue to pursue their other interests, like tax cuts and things like that, is to appeal to Hispanics, they will eventually do it. I know that their efforts up until this point have been laughable, but they will grow increasingly savvy at courting these voters if they become a more important or indeed vital part of the electorate. And so I understand the apocalyptic quotes from the right. I understand the happy, gleeful declarations of a future Democratic permanent majority from the left. But the actual situation, the actual future that we'll have in America is not so sexy as either of those. It will change. American politics will be different if immigration reform passes, but not in quite the ways that the left or right is most worried about. So moving on. Stories from a couple of days ago, but I think that it's interesting, so I am going to cover it. You might have heard of Representative Trent Franks. He is a Republican representative of Arizona who recently said a couple of things about rape that people had a problem with, especially considering the last couple of years of questionable rape and legitimate rape and all those comments like that. This is following that tradition, so he has that to rest on. So recently he said that when it comes to rape, pregnancies, the chance of you becoming pregnant are very low chances of that. Now, as I said, that's very similar to some of the comments you saw during the last presidential election. Some of the questionable Tea Party senators said similar things. And so, as expected, he was attacked for this. A number of ads were aired attacking Representative Trent Franks. And so all of that's good. But as expected, any congressman is going to find a silver lining out of this. He has found the most obvious silver lining, or perhaps green lining, because he's using the attacks against his rape and pregnancy comments to fundraise. So this is coming from a fundraising appeal from the Trent Franks campaign. It says, NARAL, Planned Parenthood, and the taxpayer-funded abortion lobby is attacking me for one reason. I'm 100% unapologetically pro-life, and I won't back down. Will you contribute $25, $50, $100, or even $500 right now to help me fight back? So nobody's surprised by this. Representatives, members of the American political establishment will use anything to fundraise. Now, he originally, after this comment, had seemed a little bit apologetic, probably not because of what he said, but because of the attacks that he was getting based on it. But now he's gone exactly back into no thinking, no empathy, political mode. The taxpayer-funded abortion lobby, come on, that's ridiculous. Every time we pass any kind of healthcare bill, there have to be like 3 layers of no taxpayer fundings for abortions. During the Affordable Health Care Act, there was like 10 different things saying you could not use taxpayer funds to pay for abortions. It will never be enough. It can never be illegal enough on the federal level to satisfy insane people like Trent Franks, but whatever. Look, the reason that I'm talking about this is because when crazy things are said, when offensive things are said, when the war on women is waged in comments like this from congressmen and from senators, it's necessary and expected, and indeed will happen, that people will fight back. But simply saying it's offensive and attacking him for a weekend or a week or whatever is not enough, because like in this case with Trent Franks, they will use the most egregious, most offensive statements to raise money to go on to pass anti-woman, anti-liberal, anti-black, anti-Hispanic legislation in the future. So you have to do more. You have to be vigilant. You have to check up the next couple of weeks. That's why I'm covering this, even though the story's about a week old, and make sure that once the spotlight is off of them, they're not using what should have been a weakness as a strength for their campaign. You have to be vigilant to make sure that they don't do this in the future. Now, turning from the hard political news to a bit of entertainment news, although with a political angle, the last news story of the day. He said he'd be back, and he was right. Arnold Schwarzenegger, former Republican governor of California, will be returning to the stage, and he will be playing some of his most iconic roles. Terminator 5, didn't know they were making it. They are making it. He will be returning. He will be playing the Terminator, and he's very happy about that. Here's the quote. He says, "I'm very happy that the studios want me to be in Terminator 5 and to star as the Terminator, which we start shooting in January. I'm also looking to do King Conan to play that role, and also to do another Twins movie. So I feel very proud of that. I feel very happy, and I'm looking forward to doing those films. For myself, at least, I've always been a fan of the Terminator franchise. Number 2 is one of my top 10 favorite movies of all time, one of the best action movies ever made. And honestly, I even thought 3, Salvation, pretty good movies. Now, I'm focusing on this both because he's a political figure, so it's fair game, whatever. But they're finally making a sequel to Twins. Twins wasn't a very new movie when I watched it when I was a little kid. It seems odd to bring it back now when he could very well have grandchildren of his own. He's going to be playing something that focuses on the fact that he's the son of someone. I think it's interesting that they're going to have Danny DeVito and they're bringing Eddie Murphy in. That sounds like fun. I'll watch it. But I'm interested to know what you think about this because, look, Arnold has made some of the best action movies ever. Like I said, Conan, iconic role, maybe he could bring something to it. But even the last time he was in a Terminator movie, when he was in Salvation, they had to use CGI because of how weird it would look. Can he really play that role now? In number 3, he was looking a little bit old. In The Expendables and things like that, he's bordering on the pretty old. And so look, if they can make good movies out of this, I'll go watch them. I'm an Arnold fan. But it seems a little bit late. I think that you can probably leave it to the Vin Diesels, to The Rock, to the people like that to take over the action movies. But anyway, look, Arnold Schwarzenegger, he has been a very interesting figure for all of his career. He came here having almost nothing. He made a fortune for himself as a bodybuilder, as an actor, eventually made it into politics. Like, this is a driven man who does not give a fuck. He will do what he wants. But it will be interesting to see that in this most recent challenge, whether or not he can actually accomplish his goals. So that's all the news for today, but the show is not over. It's another week, which means another weekly roundup. Back on the weekly roundup, some of your questions, comments from Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. Going to be responding to them. I'm going to start off with GambyMan1, who says, "Hey John, do you watch Dexter? Because I think that's a show you guys could review now that Game of Thrones is finished." He's referring to our What the Flick weekly reviews of Game of Thrones. That's done. Mad Men is finishing up in just a couple of weeks, and so we will be looking for new shows to review. Now, unfortunately, Gambyman, I do not watch Dexter. I had a friend a couple of years ago who tried to get me to watch the pilot, and I wasn't very interested in it. Now, will they review it without me? Possibly. It is a popular show. I could see that being done. But if they do, I probably will not be personally involved. Now, some of the shows we might be covering in the near future, it's very likely that Breaking Bad will be covered. Now, I have not yet watched Breaking Bad, but I am considering watching it so I could take part in those reviews because people seem to love it. Anna Kasparian says it's her favorite show of all time. I think Steve-O also said that it was great, and so I might consider watching that. In the future, The Walking Dead, almost naturally, we're going to be covering that. And possibly Newsroom, although I don't know if that show really requires a weekly review. It's interesting, and it seems fitting for us as a network, but I don't know that it deserves a review. Moving on to Rich Crab from Freebird THB says, "Have you ever played or heard of DayZ, the mod for Arma 2? Now, he was saying this in response to a tweet I put out yesterday about what weapon you would use against a zombie or something like that. And I responded to him there, but I'm also going to respond here. Yes, I have heard of and played the DayZ mod. Not really into it. It seemed like something I would be super into because I like survival horror, I like zombies and all of that. But for me, at least, DayZ was just way too buggy. The movement of the zombies was way too wacky. And eventually, you had the influx of hackers and things like that. And it made, for me, that the game just didn't work. I also played the War Z. That game had a bunch of problems. And so for now, it looks like I'm going to have to wait for a good zombie experience. I do intend to play State of Decay on Xbox Live Arcade once I actually get my Xbox hooked up again. And The Last of Us seems really interesting, although unfortunately I don't have a PS3. Otherwise, I would have already played that. Moving on, Ensign Paul says, can I have one new Superman movie without the blatant Jesus imagery? Hashtag Man of Steel. I have not seen Man of Steel, but I have heard from many reviewers, including What the Flick, that the Jesus imagery is ladled on pretty thickly on this one. Now, I don't really fault them, because I understand that there are some obvious similarities between the story of Superman and of Jesus, but the problem is when you had multiple reboots over time, and you keep playing it up in every one of them, it's not going to have as much strength the fifth time around. But I will say, while I have not seen the movie, the Jesus imagery isn't really what's stopping me from watching it. I just don't really find Superman to be a particularly interesting character. I mean, he has almost no weaknesses whatsoever. I mean, I guess his desire to not kill anyone personally, although apparently he breaks that, spoiler alert. And the kryptonite, yeah, I get that, that's a weakness, but I just don't find it interesting. I find characters like Batman, Spider-Man, to some extent, just much more engaging. Finally, Mikandri says, John, what kind of bikes did you have? Referring to some of the comments last week about anti-scooter hate and the fact that I had a scooter. So presently, I ride a Yamaha Vino 125, which is sort of middle-sized scooter. That's my main commuting vehicle, and I love it. I've had a number of motorcycles over the years. I started off with a Kawasaki EX250, which is the small Ninja, so a sport bike. I had a Honda Shadow 600 VLX, a Ducati 620 IE, the monster naked bike. Most recently, the last motorcycle I owned was a Harley-Davidson 883, the smaller Sportster. I don't think it was an R, I think it was just the 883. I also owned one other scooter, which turned out to be a Lemon. It was some cheap Chinese crap, unfortunately. And so I've owned all of these, and I have to say that while it's much slower than my Ninja, it's much less cool looking and sounds much less intimidating than my Sportster. It's just super convenient, and I love it. I think it looks good. It's easy to get around on. It's extremely cheap. I just insured it for a year for $120. It gets over 60 to 70 miles per gallon. And I've lived in LA for a year and a half with just that. And so while I understand a lot of people hate scooters and love to hate on scooters, I currently love it. Happy with my Vino 125. I intend to supplement it with a car soon. But for now, when it comes to two wheels, that's all I need. So anyway, those are the 4 comments I wanted to focus on. Losing my voice here, gonna have to wrap it up. If you have comments or questions that you'd like to see featured on a future edition of the Weekly Roundup, feel free to submit them. How can you do that? Well, you can leave a comment on this video, on the discussion thread of the channel. You can tweet me at John Iadarola, and also you can go to Facebook. I have a fan page that somebody set up. I also check that every once in a while, so feel free to leave comments there, and I'll see you next week. And that, as always, is also the end of the show. Hope you enjoyed the coverage of these stories. Tried to cover both some of the everyday run-of-the-mill political stories, you know, the back and forth and things like that, a little bit of international news, and also some stories that don't get enough coverage. So things like the Tesla, the 3D printed guns, the updates on global warming. Those are the sorts of things that even fairly responsible news shows do not cover as much as they do. And so I hope that you enjoyed the mix. Now, as always, I love to say this. If you have stories or sorts of stories that you'd like to see covered on the show in the future, this is not CNN, okay? If you send me a message, I will actually see it and respond. And I want the show to grow over time in line with what you're interested in. So I'm going to continue to respond to what you guys say. And that's it for this week. Look forward to seeing you on episode 8 in 7 days. Bye.